individual. There's clear expectations. You know exactly what you're supposed to do. Now, what are the cons? It takes away the leader's identity, their style. Often the leader will not feel as confident in the task because in being told what to do, it sometimes conflicts with how that leader would approach the problem or challenge. See, this awkwardness is then detected by his or her team and can make them less effective as part of the team building and solution process. So now what happens when the individual defines the business? Well, when the individual defines the business, we're giving employees the room to respect the outcomes, the strategies, and the metrics. But while respecting them, they approach them through their own lens. They have the freedom to utilize their own methods to not only achieve those desired outcomes, but to exceed them. So here's a different executive that responded to the pros and cons of what it means when the individual defines the business. The cons are, my leaders will be threatened. The cons or the pros are, you get more engagement from all involved in coming up with the solutions because it has more meaning to them. They take more ownership and want to see the solution work. Well, you also get a more sustainable solution because you've included a wider spectrum of the problem to be solved. It also creates a healthier culture for people to work in and be part of because they want to come to work to continue to help the business thrive and the business evolve. Now, we often want to be reminded that it's not just all about standardization, all about personalization. And I'll make this very clear. We are living at a time where standardization and personalization are at the extremes, which is really slowing progress down. You can't be all personalization without standards, nor the other way around. Because when we do this, we're disrespecting the importance of finding that right balance. And this is the balance that we have ignored for years and that has affected workplaces throughout the world. Let me give you two examples of executives who've been affected by this identity crisis. As one of them said, I wish I was 23 again because I had a lot of fresh ideas. Most of them were just too much for Fortune 500 company, and I spent 19 years trying to cull it down. You don't spend 19 years at a large company being successful without a high level of assimilation. I discovered that I really wish I had my 23-year-old self, but I find that it's really hard to reclaim, and I'm sad about that. Another one said, I practiced all the values that my organization asked me to. All of my performance ratings were high to very high based upon how they wanted me to work. I emulated my work and style based on 5 other senior executives in my organization. I did everything they wanted me to do, and I'm not being considered for the promotion. So I'd like to go to our first polling question now. Here it is. Have you ever felt tension between standardization and personalization in your career? Yes, somewhat, no. Okay, we still have votes coming in. I'll stop at the top of the minute. Okay, 82% voted. I'm ending the polling, and now I'd like to share the results to everyone. You can see that 76% said yes, 24% said somewhat. Okay, I'll let you take note of that. All right, okay, we have a question, and I'm gonna, and there's a question, and this is from Eric. He says, Glenn, great forum today. I'm curious, with today's 40 million people unemployed, can companies really employ personalization? Or could this be a watershed moment for change as all the rules are open, given the tremendous challenges companies face? Thank you, Eric. I appreciate that question. Here's the bottom line. If we move back, if we retract to old school standardized thinking, what we've just witnessed, not just in the last couple of weeks, but how we've slowly started to adapt to the limitations of COVID, we're in trouble. At the end of the day, what has been awakened is the individual to recognize that not only does their voice matter, but they actually want to be part of the solution. And if I can be so bold, I think we've all witnessed the limitations of standardization. In fact, I'll be so bold as to say that standardization finally lost its battle. Why? Because standardization was not meant to serve the mass variances in people. Thank you, Eric. Now, let's continue. Okay. Watch the following video, please.
I want to talk about a person you may have seen in this conference a little bit earlier today. You may have seen some girl in a black dress annoyingly banging away on that piano in the far corner over there. I'll introduce you to her. Her name is Brielle Lubin. It says on her card her occupation is being an 8th grader at Harvard Westlake. Pretty cool, pretty pretentious, but there's more to that. She is born from a Jewish-American father and a Japanese mother from Tokyo. She takes a lot of pride in her culture and her diversity herself. She is very proud of her Japanese culture. She's proud of her Jewish-American culture. Now, there's another person here who's standing on stage right now and talking. Her name is also Brielle Lubin. She is leading the Gender and Sexuality Awareness Club at school and the Asian American Cultural Club. And these two groups are so important because we don't really think about those people so much, I think. People will come to the Gender Sexuality Awareness Club, GSA. We've talked about for so many weeks, oh, what's going on in Brunei? People are, getting executed and so many horrible things for their sexuality. And we try to solve those problems. But how do we solve those problems when people feel like they haven't contributed? It's kind of funny why we're gathered here. We're talking about how we want to switch from standardization to personalization. You know, and we all say we wish we weren't so standard before, more individual. I think that's a really big issue. It takes a lot. It takes courage. And courage is the will to do something. That can be the will to live. And it takes so much more courage to try to solve these problems, surprisingly. As a part of the youth community, we're kind of always told, you have no idea what you're talking about. Why would you say that? That's so ridiculous. That's frivolous. Don't even think about doing that. You're too young. I may not be the CEO of a company like everyone else here. I'm just some 14-year-old kid ranting about problems that I find in a bunch of other kids. But you know what? When we start when we're younger, when we're told when we're younger, hey, you can be yourself. You can express your opinion. I can talk to you. There are places where people can talk to you and help you. I find that the most important thing, because we cannot start when we're young to think that we should assimilate if we want to not assimilate when we're older. And that's the most important thing. And we need to acknowledge that, because identity crisis comes the most and occurs the most when we don't recognize that difference, when we think we need to blend with other colors. Because quite frankly, everyone is a different shade of a color in the entire color spectrum. When you blend all the colors of the rainbow, like Roy G. Biv, you get brown. Usually, when they try to do something, they try to paint something, they don't just blend every single color of the rainbow together. They use all the colors individually. Use them as a different shade on a different part of the paper. And that's what we are. We are all that different shade of a color on that paper. That's what we need to look at. Thank you.
So we have over 50 people online streaming here on Zoom and on YouTube Live, and those numbers are growing. Who wants to jump in? We have an open mic for you. How did that video make you feel? The reason I ask is this is the future. And what makes this whole issue so complicated is that while we're all fighting and trying to solve the problems that are in front of us now, we need to keep in mind that it's not for my generation. It's for the future. It's for the Brielles of the world. It's about our future leaders and our future legacies. So there comes a question that I like. We have an open mic for here. Brian, are you available for an open mic? You could just
I am. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, perfectly. Thank you, Brian.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Glenn. Thanks for the opportunity to join today. It's interesting listening to that video. If we truly are listening to what her message is, and I would say more importantly, listening to what the world is telling us now on what we're experiencing. To me, given the current situation, it's clear that listening can lead to action, and we're starting to see some action happen throughout the world. And by listening, action allows us to really break down the barriers that can truly allow for inclusion. So what advice would you give so leaders can truly learn from what's happening right now, to have the real conversations to create strategies for systematic change, to fully allow inclusion to be a growth strategy for themselves, their teams, and their business?
That's a great question, Brian. And this is how I'd like to address it, if I may, because I think it's important that we understand the bigger picture of what we're solving for. So here you go, Brian. I'll give it my best shot. So if you look at the screen, you'll see that the cultural demographic shift has reached its tipping point. Let me explain and define for you what the cultural demographic shift means, because we're living that right now, right before our eyes. It's when large cultural segments of the population, they reach numbers sufficient enough to have a significant effect on what we do and how we act. On what we do and how we act. We're all witnessing this and have been witnessing this for years. Now, if you look at the chart, you'll see clearly that millennials and Gen Z, the most culturally and ethnically diverse populations, have already surpassed the X's, boomers, and silent generations. See, the Brielles of the world matter, and they matter a lot. So what's the dynamic here? Let's dig deep. Number one, you've seen that our workplaces have gone from homogeneity to mass variance. They've gone from sameness to diversity of thought. They've moved from standardization to personalization. What has this done? Remember, the CDS, the cultural demographic shift, it's influenced what we do and how we act. What it means is that it's created such disruption amongst people because now they're in the workplace, and mind you, the most diverse workplace in history, whether it's culturally, whether it's generationally, experience, etc. There is more diversity of thought ever. But there's a lot of people, and I'll bring the elephant in the room out right now, that are from non-diverse populations. And I always say whatever that is, because we're all diverse, but in the standardized way of thinking. These non-diverse populations are saying, well, what about me? What about me? And you know what? That's a fair question. And that question remains because no one has addressed it. It's all been about how do we respect and listen to differences from all these diverse populations. But perhaps there's something else that needs to be told, is that if you keep hearing non-diverse populations saying it's not about me, the lesson learned is this, that it's become less about diversity and much more about inclusion. And this gets to your question, Brian. What we have failed at, and again, in all due respect, because corporate strategies were not designed for mass variances of people, nor were their systems designed for inclusion, empathy, and individuality. So that's created a lot of tension. Henceforth, why we're in the extremes of standardization and personalization right now. We need to be more inclusive, and that means everyone. But if we can't create the conditions for that, then how can we solve for what's happened to George Floyd and others? And how can we begin to tackle the identity crises? In fact, let's put this to the test right now. Right now, let's go to our next polling question. Here you go. Are you mindful of your employees and or colleagues' unique differences? Take a moment. Always, sometimes, rarely, and never. Are you mindful of your employees and or colleagues' unique differences? Always, sometimes, rarely, or never. And after this polling question, I'll share what our research has shown us to date, and then we'll go back to audience questions. And we're going to stop here in another 5 seconds. We've got about 79, 80% of the people voted. So I'll end the polling now. Okay, so let's show the results. Are you mindful of your employees and her colleagues' unique differences? 66% of you said sometimes. 34% of you said always. 3% of you said rarely. I say this respectfully, but those of you that said always and sometimes, while I believe you, and this is where the dimensions and pieces get a little bit complicated, you fell into the standardization trap. You see, this is where we're at. And here's the results of the research that my organization has done for the past 6 years. Are you mindful of your employees and our colleagues' unique differences? Well, just like most of you, 74% of leaders said they are always or sometimes mindful. But here's the trick. When you ask, if I were to ask your employees, those that report to you, see, they said 80% of their employees said that these leaders are rarely aware of those differences. And here's what I have to say about this is that we as leaders are always quick. We're always quick to self-assess based upon the best versions of ourselves. We tend to self-assess based on the best versions. What's that mean? That are you always? Are you sometimes? Or do you just remember the times that you were? Now, I'd like to address another question from the audience. Okay, I see here one from Walter. Walter, if you have a question.
Yeah, Glenn, thank you very much. This is Walt. So the question I have is, so in today's society, there's a lot of divisiveness, and it's been heartening to see the strong call from both, white and people of color in response to trying to demonstrate to end discrimination and for police reform. But there's a lot of people that don't see the world the same way. They don't see end to discrimination as an issue or police reform as an issue. And my question to you is, how do these 2 points of view coexist in the workplace when there's so much divisiveness, and especially when a lot of us haven't really been in the workplace for months because of COVID? And I'm curious your thoughts on how business leaders should address this situation without blowing up their companies or getting sued. And if you do, what are the benefits? Does it relate to the bottom line? And what are the dangers of not addressing it?
Well, first of all, whenever you don't address large populations, that means you're missing an opportunity for growth. And that goes back to Brian's question. How is inclusion a growth strategy given the dynamics that we're dealing with? Well, I'm going to address your question in just a little bit, but let me give you my first reaction that starts this whole process. Do you see me and do you know me? Walt, it's very difficult to start building systemic change without the fundamentals. And what I'd advise anyone, whether it's people in the workplace, whether you work for law enforcement or government, get to know your people and flat out ask them, tell me who you are. What do you stand for? Now, we know the reality of this, right? You can do this with 30 people, 40 people. And if you can hang in there, maybe 60 people. And then what happens? You get tired, you get exhausted, and you think you know everything. My whole point is that we can't stop asking that question, because those 2 questions, do you see me, do you know me, have been the fundamental issues that have taken us to where we are today. But with respect to what actions, we're going to talk about specific things in a moment, Walt, because I think it's important that people recognize that, especially in the workplace, no one has to ask anybody for permission. And I know there's board members and governance, and I respect that. But the types of change and actions that we need to take, I guarantee you, they don't take a lot of work. What it does, it's about making sure people feel comfortable doing the work. And we've already surpassed the need for everybody to be comfortable. We've reached a point where now everybody needs to be able to do the work, knowing that it's important, but yet knowing that they'll be uncomfortable doing it. Kamala, how are you? Thank you so much for joining us. I see that you have provided a question. Did you want to speak in the open mic, or would you like for me to address? Sandy, do we know that? Yeah. Okay. I'll address it. And thank you so much for it, because it's a very important question. What are your thoughts on industries? Industries that deeply depend on standardization for safety, such as the healthcare industry. You know, I've been dealing and working in the healthcare industry now for over 7 years. If there is an industry that is steeped in standardization, it's healthcare. But here's what's interesting. And why is that? Because their regulations and protocols were designed over 100 years ago. And that's a fact, by the way. But what's different about healthcare, and what gives me hope that healthcare can do for all industries, is that it is the industry that demands personalization the most. How we treat patients, how we serve patients, how physicians engage with patient populations, how hospitals engage with their local communities to teach them about preventive care, awareness on how to be your own self-advocate for care, the importance of medical adherence. The physician-patient relationship is so intimate, it's so personal. But what's happened in healthcare is that the standards have been so stringent that, in the part that I have seen that's missing, is rather than talk about diverse populations as those that are underserved, and oftentimes just the use of the word underserved makes them feel like they're victims. But guess what? They're not. These are populations that are most susceptible to chronic disease states. And by the way, let me make that clear. Gen Z and millennials will be the largest workforce populations in history. They are. They will also be most susceptible to chronic disease states. See, both healthcare and corporations are both now in the business of healthcare. The point is that healthcare can no longer sit in a silo. And fortunately, now that patients are consumers, this integration between healthcare and corporate America will become much, much more integrated, because I believe that the largest cost center that will see rising cost will be that of benefit plans, because now they have to be personalized for every employee in the workplace. But I believe that this is where it begins, Kamala, that we need to recognize that there are advances in genomics, advances in personalized care. In fact, in healthcare, they call it person-centered care or patient centricity. Their whole business model is driven by the individual. So I share this because now it's time for these groups to stop operating in silos and start coming more together, because they need each other today more than ever before. Now, if I can continue, I'd like to share another point around, well, what are the leadership gaps that exist? And I'm sharing my screen now. And I think that this is critical, that there is a need for inclusion. There's a need for inclusion, greater focus on individuality, and a mindset shift towards personalization. And the reason I share that with you is because today we cannot continue to ignore the importance of inclusion, the importance of building systems where people aren't feeling welcomed and contributing to the influence of the organization's future. I'd like to address another Q&A question that comes up Gustavo, you just came up with one. Again, this is about you. Please ask your questions, share your opinions. Yes, Gustavo, can you, there you are, you're live and you're talking.
Hey, Glenn, hey, everyone. Thanks for the discussion and opening it up. As you were speaking, I know that today we suffer from many gaps in corporate America and in corporate in general, right? But what are your thoughts in terms of what corporations can do today among all this disruption to actually help and bring about change in society in general? It's very obvious that, you know, the government is playing a role in trying to coordinate and help out with a lot of these things that are happening with, you know, COVID, social unrest, the economy. But I see a lot of examples where corporations can actually make a difference if they, you know, find ways to keep their employees healthy and serve their customers. And actually, they are teaching the government on how to do it. So what are your thoughts on how can we incorporate help more society in general?
How we can incorporate what? I'm sorry, Gustavo?
How we incorporate America or corporate, you know, companies can actually play a more active role in the solution of these time of disruptions.
So let's just move ahead. I'm going to skip ahead, and Brian, I'll come back to your question regarding inclusion as a growth strategy. So one moment, please. I'm sorry for the technical difficulties. Okay. So first of all, I'd like to share a slide that I think may be of interest to you. These are the most common words amongst 35 companies that addressed the killing of George Floyd. And this is research that was recently done by the Wall Street Journal. And you can see that the darker the color, the more frequently the word was used. Everybody see that? And notice that I've put some here in orange, right, in frame. So notice the words support, and then down below we see action, culture. You could read these. Can you believe leadership is this far down? Also systemic. Let me share with you the words that are missing, and I'm going to address your issue directly, Gustavo. Words that are missing are strategy, partnerships, invest or investments, behaviors, accountable or accountability, educate, growth, solutions. See, Gustavo, this is an illustration of standardization at its finest. We address the issue, but we don't turn the spotlight of accountability on ourselves. And I get it. It's not always so easy. There's a certain risk profile that we want to maintain. We want to make sure that our brands are being respected and that we don't fall into a reputation management problem. But this issue has now become about people and differences in how to create this balance between standardization and personalization and find the healthy balance. And let me make sure I explain what I mean by that. And then I'm gonna give you some examples, Gustavo, of some actions that we can take. You know, oftentimes what do corporations do? They benchmark. And so if company X is doing it and company Y is doing it, big brands, what happens? That's what they do. We're quick to do what everybody else is doing rather than really deploy and define strategies that are in the best interest of our organization, our strategy, our goals as it relates to the industry that we serve. So here are some non-negotiable declarations related to corporate executives. And, you know, I really see this under behavior change and mental health, Gustavo, because without real declarations that drive action, we don't change behaviors and we continue to rise the incidences of mental health. And you know what? I have no problem telling everybody on this call that I suffer from mental health. And I know that everybody at some level either suffers from it or they know somebody that does. So here's the first one. Admit that you don't know what you don't know. You know, I've often said it seems so difficult to admit when you actually don't get it. No, we always say we get it, you get it. There's a lot of people that don't get it. In fact, what I think right now, there may be people that say they don't get it. But the point is, we need to say that openly. We just don't understand. Teach us. Help me understand you as an individual. Again, do you see me? Do you know me? In fact, if you follow professional sports, you may have seen recently in the National Football League how Commissioner Roger Goodell and the quarterback of the Saints, Drew Brees, after making initial statements that were received really poorly, they've come back and basically have admitted that they don't know what they don't know, and they've sought help to understand the issues. Number two, it's create the Office of Inclusion that reports directly to the president. Now, this is not difficult to do, but one would say, well, what about diversity? Diversity is extraordinarily important. But what has been the message today? That we've reached a point where it's not just about diverse populations, but non-diverse populations that are saying, well, what about me? The point is the cultural demographic shift has created a tipping point that those from culturally diverse populations have created enough awareness from those that are from non-diverse populations that now it's about everyone living in an identity crisis. Everyone is living in an identity crisis because we haven't found that right balance between standardization and personalization. I'm going to go over a few more, and then I'm going to go to Chris Corwin and Robert Lathan, who have some questions. The next is evolve your organization's values and leadership competencies. You know how many times I've heard people tell me that I see my values of the company, but I don't connect with them, or the leadership competencies that I'm accountable for. Gosh, do we really need to memorize so many? In fact, how can they actually measure my ability to live these things without shadowing me? In other words, the corporate playbooks for values and leadership competencies are very complex, and they feel more like corporate mandates than things that actually connect with one as an individual. So evolve them. Next is know what your people are thinking and feeling. In fact, do one best. Share with them what you're thinking and feeling. And by the way, I forgot to mention one thing about this concept of opening up this Office of Inclusion. If that's too difficult, change it from diversity and inclusion to inclusion and diversity. Because we all know that there's diversity in the world. What we lack is the ability to create systems for inclusion. And I'll get back to that one in a moment around why inclusion is a growth strategy. Revisit recruitment and hiring methods. Forgive me, but these methods and the way we go about recruitment, there's a lot of work to be done. I'll leave it at that. And then finally, we need to restore human dignity in the workplace. But I'll stop here, and I'm going to address more questions. Let's go now to Robert Lathan. Robert.
Hey, Glenn, how you doing?
Hey, Robert, how are you doing? Thank you for joining us.
No problem. Thanks for the invite. So the conversation has revolved around inclusion, and having the experience and having older adults that have worked in corporate for 20, 30 plus years, they're particularly a mother who was the head of personnel. There was always a conversation about diversity and inclusion going all the way back to the 80s. And what's very prevalent is that those conversations never yielded true results. The results that were yielded was a consolidation of power by those who were already there. if we are looking to have change, why is it that we're looking at only inclusion, and when do we and how do we get to true equity, and what does that difference look like, as well as how do we make those steps to get there?
You know, Robert, again, another conversation that has a lot of layers, but I'm going to make a bold statement because I'm asking you to share yours. I actually believe that diversity and inclusion was created to neutralize difference. I mean, when we've asked corporations, do you have employee resource groups that are volunteer efforts to celebrate differences? 35% of respondents say yes. First of all, why are we here celebrating differences in 2020? Shouldn't we know them by now? Again, it goes back to, do you see me? Do you know me? See, when you have systems that don't allow for inclusion, Robert, it makes it very difficult for issues of equality to be addressed. But I will say this in short form: equality, racism, individuality, people feeling heard and seen. These are systemic issues, whether they come from corporate America, government, higher education, that's driven by the fact that those that are in power, and I say this respectfully to those that are, that's what they know. They know they're incentivized to practice standardization. And that's why, Robert, these bigger overarching issues that you've just brought up aren't addressed. They're part of deeper layered discussions that are so far down that we need to tackle the ones here to go here. And by the way, when I say higher, lower, it's not in priority or preference or importance. It's just that these things are steeped deep in the stacks of issues that need to be resolved. But what ultimately needs to be looked at, and this goes back to Eric's question at the beginning, with 40 million people unemployed, how do we begin to hire these people again when they already know that they have more influence because of the changing dynamics in this country, for corporations and their leaders to enforce systems that actually respect, value, and allow the individual to influence more? I mean, you think that we've entered a point of tension now. Wait until things start reopening and people are hired later. It's going to further multiply this discussion that we're having today. There's another question here, or a comment. Let me go out here. From Scott Lacey. Scott, did you want to jump in? Scott Lacey, are you off mic?
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Apologies for the delay. Yeah, I would love to answer or ask a question, not answer one, because I think it's right in line with Tom's line of thinking and inquiry. And my question comes with essentially messaging and cultivating corporate culture, and that would be leading us, or messaging and cultivating, a corporate culture towards personalization, but then also towards that equality that we just talked about. What I'm finding right now is that even in a moment when, just for those that don't know me, I work at a university, and at my university, what I'm really excited about is I'm seeing a lot of opportunities to bring personalization in. But just this week, I had a big meeting in which we basically told some middle level leaders or managers that essentially we're going super open for ideas. We need to hear you. We need each of you and each of your instructors to just take responsibility around this very loose framework, because all of you have specialties and expertise outside of everyone else. And only you can basically make the best classroom that is best for you to teach and best for your students to learn. Everybody seems to get it. And we've messaged this essentially a personalization approach towards these leaders that are going out to their faculty members. But one thing that happens in response is tons and tons of emails that come back to me right away from really awesome, motivated, cool thinking people that have come up with their own ideas. And the very first thing they want to do is offer up the line to say, everybody should do this. And I'm thinking, oh my God. So we got there and then we came right back. So I'm going to go back to the question with that context. How do we message and cultivate this corporate culture? Because what I'm discovering is that it's a lot harder to get folks that are already buying in to actually jump out of the cage.
I think that this is what we're trying to do today, right, Scott, is all jump out of the cage. Look, Scott, the first thing that we all need to recognize, and it goes back to this issue of inclusion as a growth strategy, is do we have the performance metrics in leadership across the enterprise? Do we have the ability to create these inclusive cultures that give people the freedom to jump out of the cage? Do we have improved systems based on customer feedback and experience? You know, do we know and address the unique needs of individuals and in their most vulnerable place, that is of health? Look, Scott, at the end of the day, these younger generations understand the need for inclusion and personalization much more than our generations. In fact, they understand it like this. But again, what is the most important, what is the biggest barrier that gets them to come out of the cage? It's judgment. You know that judgment is more important, or measuring judgment or lack thereof is more important than employee engagement? I mean, judgment or lack thereof is at the core of a student's experience, of an employee's experience. So I just share this with you because we need to create the proper conditions. And so how do we do that? Well, what I'm going to do is go to our next polling question, and then I'm going to ask Susan to come on next, because this issue of inclusion and inclusion as a growth strategy, I think it needs to be addressed. So here's our next polling question. Our organization has performance metrics that help us measure how well we work together across functions and silos as an organization. So Megan, if you can hear me, you're the next question we're going to address. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to give this another 5 seconds and we're going to stop. We have 55% of those of you that have voted. I will end polling now. I will share the results. So Scott, perhaps this is the beginning of understanding why even when the opportunity is so obvious, we don't seize the opportunity. Now, what I'm going to do now is share what our data told us. And you can see that it's pretty much in alignment with yours. Okay. So why do I share this? And for sake of time, I'm going to just jump 2 steps forward, is that when you look at the numbers, whether it's through leadership, workforce, consumer, patient, or health, corporate America is unprepared to lead inclusion as a growth strategy. Okay, Megan, I'd like to have you ask your question, please.
I can do that. So
Thank you, Megan.
You had mentioned that as we rehire all of these individuals in the months to come, that there will be more conflict. And as a leader working through this pandemic, raising a family, teaching, homeschool, all the additional responsibilities that everybody's picked up, the thought of facing even more conflict, it's really discouraging. So I would love your thoughts on how to best mentally prepare for that, because it's coming.
Thank you, Megan. Well, first of all, I mean, let's just frame where we're at now. We are experiencing, and I'm just going to throw a comfortable number out, of 20 years of ignoring the issues. And so here we are at. So this has been an accumulation of things that has built up to this moment. You know, Megan, right now, leaders in all organizations need to be hands down, diving deep into these issues right now. Right now. In other words, right now is the time to get involved and to have these discussions. But here's what makes that challenging. Who has all the answers internally? And my biggest fear, and the reason why I believe there'll be so much conflict, is that I'm concerned that we're going to automatically pivot to what we're comfortable with in that standardized ways of doing things. So I just share this because it's going to take leaders like you, Megan, and others that are on this call to go hands in together, because we can't figure this out on our own. But the first thing we need to admit is that we just don't know what we don't know. We got one shot to do it right. And if we don't do it right, I don't know what to tell you, Megan. It's going to be a long journey. I'm sorry I didn't answer your question properly. I'm just giving you the truth. So that means that for all the leaders that didn't speak up because they thought they were going to be judged, dig in now, dive in now. You have to have the conversation. We have to break up the tension. It's real and everybody knows it. Any other questions? Brian, do you have any questions or comments?
Hi, Glenn, thanks. I think, you know, a big takeaway from today is really about how we show up as a leader to really create the conditions where our employees, our friends, our family members, and I include them because often we just look at those we're responsible for from a business standpoint, but our opportunity is far greater than the business we operate in. It's about society. So I appreciate the condition about how do we create the conditions where our employees, our friends and families can truly feel like owners of the conversation, participants of the conversation, to really have a shared journey on where we need to go.
You know, Brian, that was very well articulated. It is a shared journey. And for those who haven't started the journey, it's time to start. And for those that started the journey, just be patient. I mean, you have to keep in mind that, you know, at least as I estimate, over the next 24 months, we're going to see these ebbs and flows of new normals. And with each one of them, what we're all doing is we're disconnecting ourselves from old standards, and we're starting to embrace new ways of doing things that have been brought on by today's more personalized world. But this is a marathon, and it's going to take time. And I actually believe that there will be leaders that resign. I believe that there will be people that get discovered within the organization because they're better prepared, not by title, but because of competency and ability to be involved in conversations that they've never been involved in before. So thank you, Brian. Anybody else want to jump in Jeff, are you on the call? Or how about Jossie? Jossie, are you on the call?
Hey, Glenn, it's Jeff. Can you hear me?
Hey, Jeff, how are you doing? Thank you so much for joining.
Yeah, thank you. No, I first of all, I appreciate the opportunity to participate and learn in the forum. You and I have had a number of conversations of late about just how personal, I guess, if you will, the solve can be, whether it's the solve for industry and business, or whether it's the solve for just the simple decency and dignity of how we treat one another. And I do believe that I want to acknowledge the work that you do to help the folks such as all of us that are participating in this call and our colleagues to come face to face, right, with this challenge and be better prepared on how we behave differently with the next interaction, the next opportunity, the next place where our voice can be heard. So I just want to take an opportunity to thank you for the work that you do.
Well, I appreciate that, Jeff. And I look, there's so much that we still need to talk about. And I just appreciate you all coming today. I know that we've gone long, but we could all see just how difficult this is. It's not easy. And I certainly don't have all the answers, but the point of view I just wanted to stress today is that there's three things. The cultural demographic shift has reached its tipping point. Inclusion is a growth strategy. We must move beyond diversity and embrace inclusion. 2, we must find healthy balance between standardization and personalization. We cannot continue to limit the individual. And Robert, if you're still with us, these two things alone will lead us towards solving for inequality. And then finally, that we as executives or employees, I know it's very hard sometimes to ask yourself and or to define what role you should play. And I'll tell you why it's difficult, because you can see that we've been part of workplace environments that made those decisions for us. And so now that the moment calls, you can see the dangers of having our identity stripped away from us. And now we have to reclaim them by creating the environments to do what? Admit that you don't know what you don't know. Focus on inclusion, because inclusion solves for individuality, and individuality solves for inclusion, and they both solve for diversity. We must stop seeing others as others. We must start recognizing the importance of how to not just embrace differences, but utilize differences to drive growth for our organizations. And as the polling showed, if we can't even have systems to fix silos, you can see just how deep and wide this issue is. And finally, I just like to say this, who am I to ask you to be part of a forum that, and many of you have probably rescheduled or changed your calendars to be a part of. And I'm so grateful for that. But who am I? I'm just someone that has always felt that there's a better way. And I wrote this in my book, An Innovation Mentality, in 2007. You know how many people responded to the cultural demographic shift? They said, it'll never happen. They'll just assimilate like everybody else. And here we are today. We must lead in the age of personalization. And all I'm trying to show is that if I can take a stand to bring people together, to talk and ask disruptive and uncomfortable questions, you can do it too. You can do it too. So again, I thank you for your time. And as I always say when I end a time of when I'm here with people, is that when you lead in the age of personalization, you will see things that others don't, do what others won't, and keep pushing when prudence says quit. And if there's anybody else right now that's on a mic that wants to have any closing comments, I'd like to welcome you to say any final words.
Hey, Glenn, this is Gustavo Canton. I just wanted to say thank you so much for the invite. And just to add to what you said, which very well articulated, the last thing that I think that you did very well today to show the data and you show the research, because that is what's going to help us, to your point, educate ourselves and make the right steps towards keeping evolving. We don't want to get unstuck, and you are helping us getting unstuck. So thank you for this session, and thank you to all the participants for their wisdom and for sharing.
Gustavo, thank you. And before you leave, that gentleman, Gustavo Canton, he's actually going to be our next live streaming session on June 22nd. Gustavo is the Vice President of People Analytics for Schneider Electric, and Gustavo will be tackling the identity crisis in corporate America by going deep into the role that people analytics plays in today's age of personalization. And if you'd like to have more access to ways to become more aware, educated, share with your boss, share with colleagues, amplify the conversation, please feel free to go to ageofpersonalization.com. We've just launched the Age of Personalization documentary series that unpacks the issues that we've discussed on this call. And I hope that that can serve as an opportunity to educate and create awareness for others. On behalf of GLLG, thank you very much. I greatly appreciate your time, and I'm very grateful for it.